Well, welcome to New Covenant United Methodist Church. My name is Tinker. I'm glad you could join us today.
The message is it was not very long, and so I wanted to start with kind of a survey. We're in a new time, a season in the church calendar, and this is the first weekend of Lent. And so I wanted to kind of get from you folks, which I won't do it tomorrow, but because there are a few of us. So what does Lent mean to you? What's the big deal about Lent? And I'm assuming that everybody's been around the church long enough to have some kind of an idea or opinion about it. Everybody's got probably a different thing. So why Lent, and what's the purpose of Lent for you?
For me?
Yeah, for you.
For me, it's to give up something or to pray harder. So that's
Pray harder or give up something.
Give up something.
Okay, all right. Super.
To me, I've been through all walks of the religion, and this is a Catholic. Started from a Catholic.
I think you're right.
So
that's where a lot of the church started.
Yeah, that's where.
Yeah. Okay.
But it means something different to everybody.
Yeah. So what else?
Okay, a wise woman told me last week that it's a period of 40 days in preparation for the crucifixion. And it's to make yourself better, either like pray more or do extra service.
Make yourself better.
Yeah.
A wise person told me that Jesus might have said, you don't have to measure up, you just have to show up.
Yeah. Well, and I think
anyway,
that's it. Show up.
Okay.
Show up for those 40 days.
For show up. Okay. What else?
Well, kind of on the same line, just to really refocus
And
No one's coming.
spend
Focused.
more time.
To be more focused. And I just think that for me is it's to really dial into our spiritual journey and to kind of push things away that might distract us. But, I look back and March of Dimes when I was a kid, we had the little cups that we filled up with, and that's maybe taking off something on. So it's either, it's about giving up something or taking something on. But I think it's about changing our routine so that we have to think about it. We just spent a few days with some Catholic friends of ours, and Ash Wednesday and Friday, they don't eat meat. And nobody really talked about, okay, well, what does that mean? But I think it changes our routines enough to say, okay, why are we doing this? And to be mindful of that. So I have a couple of disciplines, and it's about discipline, isn't it? And I'm not sure how good we are at doing disciplined things that we say we're going to do, or we're going to take on, or we're not do them. But there are two disciplines that I'm going to talk about tonight that as we follow Jesus, these are two disciplines that I'm just going to invite you to consider, okay, as a way to dial into a spiritual journey. So the text of this is something that we all know. It's in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 30 through 44, thereabouts. And it's about the feeding of the 5,000. And so I'm going to, there are two things here. So let me get into the text and just tell you about it, and I'm using the text from the Message version. And so Jesus and the disciples had kind of split up, and they were doing their thing. They were teaching and healing and doing that, but Jesus gathered them all up. They came together, and they reported everything that they had been doing, teaching, and Jesus said, come off by ourselves, let's take a break and get a little rest. Ever thought about that? That sometimes we need a little bit of rest. So Jesus, was gathering his disciples and said, let's take a break. So they got into a boat and went off to a remote place by themselves. Someone saw them going, and the word got around. From the surrounding towns, people went out on foot running and got there ahead of them. When Jesus arrived, he saw this huge crowd. At the sight of them, his heart broke. He went right to work teaching and healing them. When the disciples thought this had gone on long enough, we do that sometimes. When they thought it had gone on long enough, it was now time, or quite late in the day, they interrupted. He said, "We are a long way out in the country, and it's very late. Pronounce a benediction and send these folks off so that they can get some supper." Jesus said to them, "You do it. You fix them supper." And of course they responded, they said, "Are you serious? You want us to go spend a fortune on food for their supper?" Well, I think we know the rest of the story. Now I'll kind of paraphrase it. But there are two things that Jesus did at that point that I believe transformed this informal gathering into a miracle. A miracle that we know of feeding the 5,000. So the two things that he did, he asked a provocative question. And the question was, "What do you have?" Now that doesn't sound like a very provocative question, but if we are aware of what he said, what he asked, we also know that he did not ask, "What do you need?" But he asked, "What do you have?" It's a very different question. So he asked, "What do you have?" And the other thing that he did was to gather people up. The disciples wanted them to go off by themselves, to fend for themselves. But Jesus had the wisdom to gather them up. And these gatherings were not 1 and 2 and 3 people. The text says 50 to 100. They would gather up in 50 to 100. These are significant gatherings of people. They look each other in the eyes, stand shoulder to shoulder in community through life's ups and downs. Jesus says, don't do it alone. Do it together. So these two things. And then the rest of the story, the people gathered up. Jesus broke the bread. I'm not sure exactly what he did to the fish. I don't think he broke the fish, but he distributed the fish, and everybody ate. And what happened? There were leftovers, significant leftovers. Leftovers abundantly. It was a miracle of abundance. So I'd like to think that what Jesus did that day was to spawn this miracle of abundance by doing two things. First of all, asking the question, what do you have? And then gathering people up. Two things. First of all, I want to make sure that we remember, and we often forget that Jesus was part of and immersed in an oppressed community. For 100 years, they had lived under the oppressive thumb of a greedy, violent empire. Their land had been appropriated, their resources stolen, even their livelihood, the food and the flocks that they had to feed themselves were diminished in a time when survival was already challenging. Does that sound familiar? For 100 years, they were an oppressed community. So we have to remember that. When I think about this miracle of abundance in this text, I remember an experience that I had in Portland, Oregon, when we were there. One of my favorite nonprofits Phoenix Rising Transitions was one of my favorite nonprofits that I worked with, the folks that were the creators of this. Their names Harry and Karen Olson. And Harry is an ex-con. He went to prison. I have no idea what he was in prison for. It doesn't matter to me. But regularly, he would take teaching teams, and I became one of the teaching teams going into the local prison. This prison was what I call a release prison for the men who were within a year or 2 or 3 to ending, the incarceration, and they were about to come out. So he would take teaching teams in, and these most of them were just kids, and men that were about the same age as our kids, our 2 sons. And when we would go in, we would work with them, and we would teach them about power in community, what that was like, and about the power of their own stories of transformation, because all of them had some kind of transformation experience through this. We would encourage them to look at their own giftedness and joy as resources for thriving in the world. In effect, we would ask, what do you have? What do you have? What are your God-given talents that can be put toward the common good? And of course, these kids knew what they needed. We didn't have to ask them what they needed, because we couldn't really provide that. They needed jobs, and they needed job training, because they were labeled as felons when they came out, and to get a job in that environment was just almost impossible, and to get places to stay. And so without those, of course, you are in need of food and shelter and clothing, and most of all, they knew that they needed community. And I'm not talking about the jokers that they hung out with that helped them get into the slammer in the first place. They needed community. When they got out, they were invited. They were invited when they got out to participate in an organizing effort that I was fortunate enough to be part of. Gather people up routinely, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. And people from the faith community, synagogues and mosques and churches and labor unions of all kinds, and nonprofits like Phoenix Rising Transitions. And we would get together and we basically ask the question, what do you have? What do you have? And out of this came a long-term strategy to walk through life shoulder to shoulder, working together for the common good. That helped us all of us, to find our footing. Together in community, we found what we had, and then we were able to find out what we need, and to be able to have the capacity to provide that. It was a miracle of abundance. And there was empowerment, and there was joy. I want to spend just a little bit of time breaking down these disciplines. Considering the question, what do you have? Most often when we're considering those who are under-resourced or repressed or oppressed community, poverty, hunger, living outside, or homeless, we jump to the easy answer question, what do you need? Because we think that that's what we need to provide. We need to provide what they need. And this is a question that our service community asks, and they respond to that. And we all know, I think we all know, that providing food and clothing, other necessities, and even shelter is a temporary fix. I think we know that. And most often, it's done by people with power and resources. So at best, providing food and clothing and necessities, at best it fills a belly for a day, a place out of the weather for a night, even and it makes us feel better for a day. At its worst, however, it's It perpetuates a hierarchy among cultures. It perpetuates structural racism, sexism, homophobia, and it protects the status quo and tends to create dependency. That's at its worst. And I've been on both sides of this fence and will probably be on both sides of this fence again, of course. There are no easy answers, particularly with the question of what do you have. But I'm convinced, folks, that you can't serve away poverty, hunger, and homelessness. So what do you have? It's a question of empowerment. It's a question that is expansive rather than limiting, full of possibilities and potential rather than scarcity. And in community, this is a question of abundance. The other part of this, these disciplines is community, and that, folks, that's something that the church knows how to do. We know how to do community. We know about community. Walking shoulder to shoulder, community is about barn raising. It's about stone soup. It's about neighborhood cleanup. It's about covenant relationships of love and support and even accountability. I think we know about community. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at Walgreens, and I'm just picking up a couple of things that we needed. And there was a young woman at the checkout counter with a fleece sweater embroidered with the words, Navajo Pride. And I looked around, and I was just the only one in line. So I asked her about it. Tell me about Navajo Pride. And so we had this conversation, and we were back and forth, and then all of a sudden I realized that there were 5 people, behind me. And I'm going, okay, I'm sorry. But in the meantime, she talked about a project. She said, this is Navajo Pride. They have a project in her kids' school where once a year they'll go out to Navajo Agricultural Products, south of town, and help harvest pumpkins. And they do that to benefit the school. So I have learned a lot since we moved back to Farmington about 3 years ago about our Navajo neighbors and what they have. I can tell you that they have the strength of clan and family, which is foundational in their lives, to be connected with their family and their clan. They also have this food system that empowered a robust and vital existence for generations. And I'm not talking about fry bread or Navajo tacos or green chili cheeseburgers, but rather corn and squash and beans, and who knows, maybe pumpkins as well. And as a congregation that views and promotes itself as inclusive, I just think service tends to create obstacles for us, where empowerment has the potential to build bridges. I really believe that Lent is a time of dialing in on our spiritual journey, our faith, and stripping away the distractions that we have, whether we take something on or leave something off. It just changes our routines, but it helps prepare us for the new day that dawns at Easter or whenever that happens, or and other miracles of abundance. So I'm just inviting us to consider these as Lenten disciplines. What if we were to follow Jesus' lead and to do these 2 things that spawn this miracle of abundance? To ask the question, what do you have? And just leave off, what do you need? And just leave that for another time. And to gather people up in Jesus, to gather people together, and walk shoulder to shoulder with each other to experience the joy of the new day dawning. Miracles of abundance. It may be just a matter of changing a question and believing deeply in the radical goodness of community to find ways to gather up rather than send away. Building bridges between cultures rather than creating barriers with love, compassion, agency, and interdependence.